Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 28, Communitarianism and Civic Republicanism. And we start with topic Civil Republicanism and Introduction. Civic Republican political theory takes its starting point from a long established tradition of thinking about politics. A tradition that is understood to have contributed significantly to the development of democracy. This tradition is associated with such political thinkers as Aristotle, Cicero, Guicciardini, Machiavelli, James Harrington, and Rousseau, as well as with the many Commonwealth theorists of the 18th century. In recent times, this tradition has been defended and developed by Hannah Arendt, John Peacock, Quentin Sneaker, and Philip Pettit, among others. The term republicanism is defined and understood in contrast with monarchy or the personal rule of kings and emperors. Whereas a monarch enjoys personal authority over his subjects and rules his realm as his personal possession, and more or less to realize his personal interest. Government in a republic is, in principle, the common business of citizens conducted by them for realizing the common good. The idea of republicanism thus develops from a desire and the attempt to replace the empire of men with the empire of law. The civic republican perspective begins by adopting some of the important ideas of Greek political thought. In fact, civic republicanism begins, as does Greek political thinker, from the premise that man is by nature a social political animal. Men, however, are also moral beings, as they embody certain moral purposes. Naturally, therefore, and in order to realize their interest and develop their true selves, men must live together in a political association, more specifically in a self-governing political community. A self-governing political community is one in which citizens participate to realize the good of both the individual as well as the collective. In a republic, then citizens are essentially virtuous as they place the common good above their particular individual goods. To put in a nutshell, a good polity is an association of good citizens being those who possesses the quality of civic virtue or the predisposition to seek the good of all in public matters. To use Aristotle's words, the end of a political community is the good life, and the good in politics is the common interest. Underlying and contributing to the civic republican ideal of a good polity are somewhat distinct ideas of freedom and government, ideas which Republicans conclude go beyond and are deeper than the dominant liberal notion of freedom and government. It is this distinctiveness which they believe makes civic republicanism a compelling theory of political order and freedom. Below, we examine the civic republican ideas of freedom and government. Next point is the idea of republican freedom. At the heart of civil republicanism is a distinct and supposedly rich idea of freedom. According to Republican theorists, this idea of freedom contributes to the discourse on freedom by going beyond the traditional dominant liberal conception of freedom. To understand the distinctness and contribution of this idea, it would be helpful to give a summarized account of traditional conception of freedom. In an important work titled Two Concepts of Liberty, Isha Berlin drew a distinction between what he understood to be two different conceptions of liberty, namely negative and positive liberty. The idea of liberty has since been understood with reference to this distinction. According to Berlin, the negative conception of liberty requires the absence of interference by others, where interference be understood broadly to mean any intentional form of obstruction or coercion. The positive conception of liberty alternatively required a presence rather than an absence, the presence of self mastery, where self mastery is interpreted as the ability of an individual to master his passions with his reason. In 1988, Benjamin Constant, in a famous lecture titled The Liberty of the Ancient and the Liberty of the Moderns, developed the distinction between negative and positive liberty. While the liberty of the moderns was identified with the negative conception of liberty, defined as the absence of interference. The liberty of the ancients was defined differently, yet positively, as the rights of the individual to participate in the process of democratic self determination. It is worthy of mention that the liberal political tradition has been dominated by the negative conception of freedom as non interference. According to the civic republican tradition, the distinction between negative and positive freedom, between the liberty of the ancients and the liberty of the moderns, fails to capture the true essence and value of freedom. As an alternative, Republican theorists develop and advocate the idea of Republican freedom. Republican freedom, they argue, although akin to the traditional distinction, transcends it to deliver a richer and more valid account of freedom. As noted by Pettit, the Republican conception of liberty is akin to the negative one in maintaining that what liberty requires is the absence of something, not necessarily the presence. It is akin to the positive conception in holding that which must be present has to do with mastery rather than with interference. Freedom consists not in the presence of self mastery and not in the absence of interference by others, but rather in the absence of mastery by others, in the absence of domination. Freedom just is non domination. Underlying the Republican notion of freedom as non domination is an understanding of the meaning of domination as well as its relationship with interference. Domination, as understood by the Republican, is the ability and capability of one agent to exercise power over the other, particularly the power of arbitrary interference. In other words, a person is dominated by an other and thereby unfree to the extent that the other has the capacity to interfere on an arbitrary basis in his or her affairs. Such a relationship of domination is exemplified in the relationship between master and slave or servant, employer and employee, and even husband and wife, where the dominant agent interferes arbitrarily in the affair of others, thereby restricting the freedom of others. According to Civic, Republicans, the distinction between the negative and positive liberty fails to address the denial of freedom as domination. It is such indifference to the notion of domination as a denial of freedom that allowed liberals to remain for long tolerant of relationships of dominance at home and in workplaces. The relationship between domination and interference, according to Republicans, is deeper as well as more problematic than is apparent. Domination, as they argue, can be experienced and exercised without actual interference, such as experienced by the lucky slave. Contrarily, interference can be practiced without real domination, such as in the case of a good polity, which interferes in the lives of the citizens to promote their welfare and well being. It is therefore possible to have domination without interference, just as it is possible to have interference without domination. What we need to protect ourselves from is not all forms of interference, but only those forms of interference which are of an arbitrary dominating nature. On this ground, the negative conception of freedom is non interference appears insufficient as it fails to distinguish between desirable and arbitrary form of interference. It ignores the extent to which interference may, in some cases, contribute to the sustenance and promotion of individual freedom and welfare. The Indian state, for instance, interferes in the freedom of its citizens in different ways, such as to ban certain civil practices sanctioned by religious custom, like untouchability and sati, as well as to provide certain specific rights and welfare in the form of affirmative action to the underprivileged section of society. In fact, most states, if not all, interfere in the economic life of their citizens through policies of taxation, which is then employed for the distribution of welfare goods such as health, education, and housing, among many others. By defining freedom simply as non interference, political theory would indeed be insufficiently placed in justifying such necessary acts of interference by the state. The idea of republican freedom as non domination gives space for such laws, which, although do interfere, do not enslave or dominate both, but rather free one from domination and subjugation by others. As mentioned above, the negative conception of freedom as non interference follows from the liberal understanding of freedom as natural and the state as a necessary evil. For the Republican, in contrast, the cause of freedom rests squarely with the law and the state. The laws of a good state, a republic, create the freedom enjoyed by citizens. They do not offend against that freedom. The state, in this view, is not antagonistic to civic freedom, rather, it is freedom friendly. To use Harrington words, liberty in the proper sense is liberty by laws, not liberty from the laws. It may be noted that with the idea of freedom as non domination, civic republicanism tends to agree with the conception of people as situated in certain communities and cultures rather than with the individualistic conception of the self as detached and disembodied. Domination is often associated with certain cultural makers, such as gender, race, religion, and class, among others. A person facing domination is more likely to belong to a vulnerable class. Freedom as non domination can be enjoyed and guaranteed only in so far as the silent groups to which these people belong enjoy it. Upholding the Republican idea of freedom, Pettit argues that it is only when the idea of freedom as non interference is replaced with that of freedom as non domination would be the political theory and practice of such struggles as feminism, multiculturalism, and environmentalism gain recognition and response. In fact, it is argued that the Republican notion of freedom went out of fashion in the 18th century when citizenship was extended beyond the realm of proprietary males and when it was no longer possible to think of making all citizens, particularly women and servants, free in the Republican sense. Freedom, if guaranteed to all, had to be less demanding. It may not be incorrect to argue that underlying the Republican idea of freedom as non domination is a value of equality, whereby no one is dominated by and thus unequal to the others. Freedom requires the capacity of each individual to stand as an equal with fellow citizens in a shared awareness that no one has the power of arbitrary interference over the other. The idea of Republican freedom appears to be somewhat more compatible with and well disposed to the ideas of democracy, welfare, and empowerment, ideas that have gained currency and importance in contemporary political theory and practice. Here we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.